Church, where did it come from? If you've been a believer for any length of time, there are some questions that has risen up in the past number of years regarding church. I've been in church all my life, literally over 50 years. And in 1978, someone handed me a cassette tape regarding New Testament Christianity. And one guy, preacher stated that the word church is not found in the Bible. So I looked it up, couldn't find out what he said was true. And from 1978 until this very day, I've been studying church. But the question is, where did the church building come from? Because a church building is not found in the Bible. Early Christians did not go to church. They did not become a member of a church. They did not join a church. Anything regarding church was completely unknown to them. It was. There was no such thing as a church service. Church buildings were completely unknown. So where did it come from? Constantine, a Roman emperor who supposedly had become a Christian in the early 4th century. That's where buildings came from. It came from him. Now I'm going to be reading from this book. This book is called Erdman's Handbook to the History of Christianity. And it is very good. It gives you some insight regarding Christianity, when it was first formed, and even after the last apostle died. So I'm going to be reading quite a bit of this, and I'm going to be bypassing a lot of it simply because it's not necessary to what I'm trying to say. On page 150, the heading is Building for Worship. Reading. Constantine's pronouncement of freedom of worship for all in the Edict of Milan 313 was seen reflected in the buildings used for Christian worship. Remember that date, 313. And he wrote an edict called, what was it? Regarding Christians worshiping. The emperor himself built a new church in Rome, which symbolized the dawn of a new era. This church of St. John Lateran was a basilica. Now, that's what they called the buildings at that time. They didn't call them churches. They called them basilicas. Basilica. And in all the main centers of the empire, this style of church seemed rapidly to have replaced the house church. Because remember now, in the beginning, Christians met in homes. They didn't meet in no religious building of any kind. The scripture clearly says that we are the temple of the living God. Now, the Spirit of God does not dwell in buildings made by hand. Now, this book gave a description of the basilica. Now, I'm going to see if I can show you this. See this right here? That right there? That's a basilica. Now that circle right there at the end, that is where the bishop sat. That was one of the main designs of the early church. It was called a basilica. And what's so interesting about it, it's kind of weird when I read this. The congregation sat on the side of the building. And in the center, that's where the choir was. Now, it's kind of weird, but that's exactly what I was reading. You know, I got to bypass a lot of this for a reason. Let me see where I can start. All right, the appearance of this new and fully developed plan for church buildings has led to the suggestion that Constantine imposed it on the church and commanded that it should be followed everywhere. It seems more likely that the plan was gradually adopted by the builders of churches simply because it was the most suitable available, and that these developments began before the time of Constantine. The Basilica plan was followed because it provided what the church needed in its altered circumstances. Most obviously, it provided the space needed for the much larger congregations which now gathered for worship. Now, why larger congregations? Because once Constantine made Christianity the state religion, everybody wanted to be a part of it. See, Christianity really started basically under persecution. The Romans did not understand it. They persecuted it, as well as the Jews under the old law. They didn't accept it either. That's why Saul, who was renamed Paul, persecuted them. Because what they were saying was contrary to the law of Moses. All right, now let's go on. The house church has usually provided enough room for the persecuted Christians, the house church. Now that Christianity was respectable and officially recognized, the numbers of worshipers increased rapidly, and bigger accommodations was needed. Pagan temples was not designed to house a worshiping assembly, whereas various forms of basilicas was commonly built to accommodate crowds attending a law court, market, or any kind of assembly. Now I'm going to stop right there. So, Constantine is the reason why we have church buildings. Once he made Christianity a state religion, everybody wanted to be a part of it. Christianity became popular. Christianity became a part of the world. Church buildings replaced house churches. But not only that, once these basilicas was formed, it took away all of the energy of the body of Christ. It took away the gifts of the Spirit. It took away the power of the people. When Christians met in house churches or house assemblies, everybody had a voice. Everybody had something to say. But once these church buildings came into operation, one person was put over it, and he was called the bishop. He became the voice or the major voice in that building. Everybody else who came into that building became the listeners. Now listen to this now. I'm going back to reading. Worship, page 159 now. Worship in the house church had been of an intimate kind in which all present had taken an active part. See, that's found in 1 Corinthians 11, 12, 13, and 14. One has a psalm. One has a tongues. One has interpretation of tongues. One has a prophecy and giving and working of miracles. Everybody had a gift to share. Everybody had something from God to share according to the Spirit of God. And Jesus Christ was the head of that local assembly. And they had elders overseeing it. But once this Basilica came into operation, once Constantine established this as being the place where the body of Christ should come to worship God, all that stopped. One person was put over it, and he was called the bishop. But let me read that again now. Worship in the house church had been of an intimate kind, in which all present had taken an active part. But by the beginning of the 4th century, that's 313 AD, the beginning of the 4th century, the distinction between clergy and lay people was becoming more prominent. Notice now, clergy and lay people. Because once that building was established, he was considered a part of the clergy. If you was not a part of the clergy, they became the laity. The clergy taught. The laity listened. The clergy had the power because he was the head of that building. Constantine started this. All right. About this time, the liturgy changed from being a corporate action of the whole church, that means everybody had something to share, into a service said by the clergy to which the laity listened. This may have influenced the choice of the Basilica plan for the new churches. Certainly, the Basilica pattern made it easier for the distinction between clergy and lay people to harden. It was beginning to be set in stone. The ASP, that's the APSE. Now the ASP was this little place right here, right there. The APSE, that's where the clergy sat. He had his own special place niched out in that building. The ASP was reserved for the clergy. And those not actively taking part in the service sat on a bench against the wall. They didn't sit in the center of the building. They sat on a bench against the wall, people. I'm reading this. This is in this book. That's how the first church building, a basilica, as it was called at that time, was set up. The congregation sat against the wall. The choir was in the center of the building, and they sang a lot of the services. The singers. A throne, listen to this, a throne was set up in the center for the bishop. That's what it's called, the APSE was. A throne was set up in the center for the bishop. And his stately chair reflected his position as a trusted imperial servant as much as a pastor of the flock. The table for the Lord's Supper became a permanent altar at the front of the APSE. Now notice now, have you ever noticed churches, many churches, where they got this table in the front of the pulpit on the floor? They had a table too, where the Lord's Supper was done. Now, that's amazing, isn't it? That started in 313 AD. Over 1,800 years ago, And the pattern has not changed hardly since. The central space, or nave, was occupied by the choir, who sang the service, and by the lower ranks of the clergy. The ordinary worshipers tended to be confined to the side aisles. Listen to this. Men on one side and women on the other. I'm stop reading right there. Men on one side, women on the other. Why men on one side and the women on the other? That came from the Jewish pattern. That came from, I know where that came from. That came from the Jewish pattern of worship. Well, actually, when the Jews went to hear the word of the law in these synagogues, but that's where all that mess came from. It came from the church, because when Christians met on the Basilica, which was later named church, and one person was put over it, and he was called the bishop of that basilica. Later, it was called a church. And they had this chair set in it, in the center. And what's so interesting, that chair was actually made of stone. It really was. It was really a part of the building. Let's see, I got it. Oh, I took that paper out. No wonder it's hard for me to find it, because I wanted to try to show you what that chair looked like. But now I took my paper out, so I can't find it as quick as I need to find it. But that's where church came from. Here it is, right here. Church came from. See if I can show this to you. See right here, right there, that right there. All that stone. And that place right there where those two places are, that window. But right there, that's a part of that stone seat right there was where the bishop sat. And everybody around him were elders or people of importance. But that stone, that was the chair. That's where the bishop sat, who was later called pastor. He was the voice of that church. He taught. Everybody else listened. Constantine started this. He's the reason why we have church buildings. He's the reason why the body of Christ is ineffective. What you mean, Brother Glover, ineffective? See, in the beginning, the scripture says, these signs shall follow them that believe. In my name they shall cast out devils, they will speak in new tongues, they shall do this, blah, 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 this, and another. 1 Corinthians 11, 12, especially 12, 13, and 14, talks about the gifts of the Spirit, and that everyone has a gift. You are a part of the body of Christ. Once you become saved and born again, you become a member of Jesus Christ. You become a part of Him in a figure of speech. But that all changed when the church building came into being, because once that church building came into being, all that stopped. You had to join a church building. You had to become a member of a church building. You had to dress up to listen to the clergy tell you what God is saying. The clergy to tell you what the Bible is saying. You don't have no understanding what the Bible is saying unless the bishop tell you, aka pastor, tells you now. It's sad, but it's the truth. 1800 years ago, Satan did a bait and switch on the body of Christ. And it has been going on now for a very long time. There is nothing in the Bible about joining a church, going to a church building, hearing a sermon from pastor, who used to be called bishop, then you got to pay him 10% of your income for the maintaining of the gospel and for that building. I'm going to talk to you about Nehemiah 10th chapter later on, probably in my next video. See, Constantine is where church buildings came from. When Jesus Christ said in Matthew 16:18, upon this rock I will build my ecclesia, which really he was saying I will build my assembly. The biblical scholars that King James got to quote to reinterpret the Bible from into the King's English, they were going to use the word congregation. But King James said, nope, don't do that. Put the word church in there. And they had to obey him. I've already talked about it in a previous video. And if you've done your homework, you should understand that and know that. But I've been in church all my life, people. And when I finally began to understand this in 1978, I was shocked. But I kept on reading and studying. And at the same time, 78, 88, and 98, 2008, I've been trying to get the body of Christ to understand. We are doing it wrong. We are. We are doing it wrong. None of that, what we do, is in the Bible. So in order to justify what preachers do, they bring some scriptures out of the Old Covenant, out of the Old Testament, to justify themselves, as well as just simply hang on to scriptures. Because, see, you got choirs in the Old Testament. You do. But they are not in the New. If someone had a song to sing, they simply shared it. That's right. Well, anyway, that's it. That's it. God bless.